Fill in the loud. I normally, she says normally, this is like sermon number 6 or 7 maybe. So, I mean, the clock is ticking, or it's something, the counter, something. So normally in the past I've used my iPad to take me through things and make sure I don't deviate from the plan. This feels like it's is this an okay place? It's okay. Okay, no, I just want to make sure that I'm not with trust the process, Maria says. I'm a bit of a control, not going to say freak, but anyway, it's hard to trust the process. It's fine. I'm fine. We're all fine. Good morning, says my script. So I'm going to try my laptop this morning is the other half of the sentence I started a minute ago. And I'm hoping this will work well. This feels like it's an appropriate height for my not height. So, all right, so good morning. My name is Christy. You see me a lot doing the welcome and things here with the church. I'm on staff. My present title is Connections Coordinator. I am on the long journey toward ordination. It is a long journey, so it's a good one though. So I've already done seminary and licensing school and other things. So Connections Coordinator is essentially a kind of a broad catch-all term, sort of, to catch all the things that I am responsible for. You'll often find me filling in more or less as the role of an associate pastor around here. So but just the title now is Connections Coordinator, so that's what that is if you look on the website. I am very passionate, though, about education, speaking of Christian education, so I'm really excited for the formation of our Compassionate Leader Academy. But my passion for education and Christian education specifically also means that anytime I am scheduled to preach, you can be sure that I will add a little bit of a historical approach to things. So, Jesus told us to love God with all of our soul, our heart, our mind, our strength, and I don't think that we're living into the fullness of what God has for us if we leave out our mind, then it's included in that, right? So whenever we come to read the scriptures, it's always important to check in with our hearts, our feelings, our spirits, our soul, to kind of see how the Word of God is moving us, if we want to be moved enough to then act, right, and to use our strength. But in a close reading, I think we'll find that what we're looking for, but we're also going to be challenged and motivated to do something. And that will include using our minds, which is my justification for bringing in dates and history, and you'll see a map later, So, but it's in a fun video, so, okay. But, so the second part of Jesus's oft-quoted words there that I was referring to is the famous sentence, love your neighbor as yourself. And he says, love your Lord, your God. But it's like popping. Move it down a little bit. Okay. So he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And I really believe that it's that first command that makes the second possible. By loving God with all that we are and all that we have, are we then able to truly love our neighbor and maybe love ourselves too? So, and of course, when we read the scriptures to get to know who God is, we're going to be connecting our heart to God's heart. We're learning about God's big meta-narrative, right, or God's big story. And the Bible, though, in that endeavor, the Bible often gives us more questions than answers. So I just, like a reassuring moment before we get into the topic today, I guess is what this is. Richard Rohr is a French priest and author, and he wrote that the Bible is supposed to challenge us. It's not, he says, a quick answer book. So when we read the scriptures, we are supposed to be challenged, and we are supposed to, or it is supposed to, he says, create problems for us. And I love that. So it is through this struggle, right, through the intellectual and through the spiritual wrestling that we grow. And growing means moving from one thing to another. Right, when my kids grow, we have to leave one shoe size behind for another shoe size. We have to leave behind the things that we grow out of to move into the new things. We must be willing to leave those things behind if we want to truly grow more mature in our faith and develop in our knowledge of God. So if we feel like reading the Bible is creating problems for us, then I dare say we're doing it right, with our heart, soul, mind, and strength. So I say all that to say this. Bringing historical context to Scripture helps us understand it, I think, and it really matters then for our faith and for our ability to remain hopeful and to remain compassionate during hard times. And I also just want to mention that when you encounter sticky theology situations, if you want to talk it through with someone, you should reach out to Joe. No, but I'm also... That's my funny joke. It's like if you've had great service today, I'm Christy. If you haven't had great service today, I'm Joe, right? No, but but I'm also really happy to talk through. I love wrestling with let's talk about weird doctrine stuff, and that's the stuff where Joe's like, ew, you like doctrine? And I'm like, yeah. So you're not alone, right? If you encounter something and you're like, what the heck does that mean? Call somebody, reach out to us, email, text, anything, it's fine. So we won't always have answers. Maybe we go, I don't know, let's figure it out, right? Let's talk it through together. All right, and really quick, not in my notes, but I wanted to make sure so that nobody was like wondering through the whole service. My shirt says, the horrors persist, and so do I. So, I love, your applause makes me feel that I don't need to explain it, so I love that. So that's all I'll say about that, I guess. But because it's like wrinkled because of the microphone, and I also just didn't, I'm standing behind this. I didn't want it to distract you, wondering, because I would be distracted. Like, what on earth what is the thing up the, So that's what that says. And yes, I wore it on purpose. It's on theme, and you'll see what I mean, okay? So it's on message. So if you're mad about that, it's biblical. All right, so today then, turning toward the topic, as part of our Leadership in Exile series, I was assigned the book of Daniel. So before looking at Daniel, though, I thought it might be good to review what we've learned so far in the series, just in case you haven't been here and just to kind of bring us all up to speed. So 2 weeks ago, Joe talked about the story of Joseph, and then last week, Sam preached a message on the book of Esther. Joseph was one of Jacob's sons. So Jacob had 12 sons, and they became the patriarchs for the entire people of God. They're often collectively referred to as the 12 tribes of Israel. And if you happen to be anything like me, you owe a debt of gratitude to Sir Andrew Lloyd Webber for writing a musical about Joseph's story. I don't know if anyone knows. Jacob and Sons, right? Anyone? No, okay. Yes, Alex in the back. So it's a great show, but it is like one of the stories from the Bible that I know the best because I can like literally sing the whole thing. So that's great. But from Joseph's story, we learned that integrity will grow our daily choices. Joseph made the choice to remain faithful to God and continue to do what he knew to be right, no matter what situation he found himself in. And as we learned from Joseph's story, basically none of them were things he chose. If you can even imagine living your life that way. He didn't choose hardly anything that happened to him. And yet he came out on top, is what the show will show you. So his capability and trustworthiness led him to become the second in command over all of Egypt. He was the very right hand of the Pharaoh. And he chose to welcome his brothers and his families to live in safety in Egypt, despite how they had treated him. And thereby, Joe made the point, breaking free from generational cycles of abuse and trauma. Now, of course, human history proves that Joseph did not solve generational abuse and trauma, but his story does prove that one's decisions are their own, and the choices one makes will certainly shape their future. So from Joseph's story, Joe also challenged us with the question, when a person finds themselves placed in a position of influence, how can one use that influence for good without losing their position? And from Sam, we learned about Esther's story as a Jewish woman who was chosen by the king of Persia to be his new queen. Through deception and trickery, the chief's king minister Haman convinced the king that the Jewish people should all be slaughtered. It's not in my notes, but if you have friends that are Jewish, or if you know anything about like Jewish culture, they throw like a party every year in celebration of this, and they retell the story. And anytime someone says Haman, they all go boo really loud. So just now when I said it in my head was like boo. Anyway, so I should have put it in my notes because it's a funny thing. So the next time I say it, I don't think I will again, but anytime, right? We'll just boo at each other and we'll know what we mean. Anyway, so Esther put herself in harm's way in order to plead for the preservation of her people, and it worked. Sam said that one of the lessons from Esther's story is that God uses unlikely people to work through. It's important to remember, I think, that you could be that unlikely person, or you could in your life encounter that unlikely person. And really, it's probably going to be both at different points, right? Sam also reminded us that standing up for justice may come with a cost. Esther's life was literally on the line when she went before the king, her husband, to ask him to save her people. So, turning our attention to Daniel, the first thing that I want to point out for us is the book of Daniel is sort of separated into two larger parts. The first half is stories about Daniel's life in Babylon, and the second part is apocalyptic visions of the future that Daniel was given, visions that were offering a bright hope for those living under persecution. Now, Joe is planning to spend time with the whole book of Daniel later on this year, like summer-ish, I think, so I wanted to focus today on just the first half, which are the stories of Daniel's life when he lived under exile. So that's the first purpose of this section of stories, actually, is to help set the scene for the reader so we know where we are, to present the context that will then help the reader understand the lessons. And it begins with, right, chapter 1, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. So that's the very first sentence. It just like plops us right in the action. So, though, instead of listening to me talk through the history that leads us to the beginning of that book, I thought a little video clip might be more fun. This is where the maps are. So there's a 3-minute video that I have from a series called What's in the Bible. It was created and produced by Phil Vischer, one of the VeggieTales creators. If you know, it's Bob the Tomato, is the voice is of Phil Vischer. So this series is entertaining for adults to watch alongside their kids. It's kind of made for kids, but it also explains the meta-narrative of God seriously better than like any other resource I've ever seen. It's like the best series, I think. And unless you've seen the series, the various puppet characters like won't mean anything to you, but you just kind of got to go with it, so it'll be okay. So you can go ahead, Tim.
So now that we've run out of kings, what happens next? Do they choose a new form of government?
Yes, perhaps a representative government with 3 branches, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. I've heard that can work well.
Have you been watching C-SPAN again?
It helps me sleep at nap time.
No, they didn't switch to a different form of government. There are no more kings because time has run out.
What do you mean?
The children of Israel have been warned over and over again since way back with Moses in the wilderness. God told them he would bless them and protect them in this new land if they were true to him and obeyed his commands. If they didn't stay true to God, enemies would carry them out of the promised land. When King Solomon dedicated the new temple in Jerusalem, he reminded the Israelites again that enemies would carry them all away if they did not stay true to God.
They haven't been true to God at all.
No, not at all.
While the kings of Judah and Israel have been ignoring God, 2 great enemies have been growing in the east, Assyria and Babylon.
Oh dear.
God is true to his word. For 200 years he waited patiently for the northern tribes to turn back to him. Now he was done waiting.
God removed his protection from the northern tribes. In 722 BC, the Assyrians swept over Israel and destroyed it. The last king of Israel, Hoshea, and most of the Israelites in the north were dragged off in chains to Assyria. The northern kingdom no longer existed.
What about the southern kingdom?
God gave Judah more time, since they were the children of King David. But for every king who followed God, like Josiah, there were 2 more who didn't, like Manasseh and Ammon.
If God's chosen people ignored him, if they worshipped other gods and God did nothing about it, the world wouldn't learn to respect God's holiness.
Finally, God couldn't wait any longer. He had to do what he said he would do.
God removed his protection from Judah. In 586 BC, 140 years after the fall of the northern kingdom, King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians attacked and captured Jerusalem. The last true king of Judah, Jehoiakim, and many of the people of Judah and Benjamin were dragged off to Babylon in chains. What's worse, Jerusalem was burned. Her walls were pulled down, and Solomon's temple, God's dwelling place among the Israelites, was completely destroyed.
Destroyed, is what he's saying. Yes. All right, see, it's more fun than me just talking. So, as we just learned, Daniel's entire adult life then is lived in exile. According to the record in chapter 1, he is deported to Babylon in 606 BCE, and he remains there then until the beginning of the rule of Cyrus, which is the Persian king who conquered Babylon in 539 BCE. So that is a span of 67 years. If you hear the Jewish people talk about the exile, they'll usually just kind of round it to 70 years because there's always some spillage, right? It wasn't like hard stop on exile, you know? So anyway, I really though, I wanted to just sit with that for a second. If you think about Daniel and his life, 70 years, his entire adult life was lived under empire in forced exile in a foreign land where everything is different. And actually, after Cyrus conquered Babylon, Daniel remained in service to the throne, and we'll hear about this in a moment, but under the Persian king then. So he really did live out his entire life under empire. Now, reading back through history, we have the distinct advantage, of course, of knowing how things end, right? Again, we put a hard date on stuff, start, stop. But, we know the year that Babylon was conquered, and Cyrus permitted the Jewish people then to return to Jerusalem and begin rebuilding their temple. But when they were in it, right, they had no idea. Everything felt extremely hopeless. The prophet Jeremiah even told them that God's word to them was to settle down and settle in. Build houses, they were told. Cultivate gardens. Give your children in marriage within the community, right? And grow your lineage. That takes years. Jeremiah 29:7 even has this instruction from God. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you will too. Can you even imagine? An enemy land where you and your people are the despised foreigners, and God's instruction is to cultivate gardens and pray for the prosperity of the ones who destroyed their homeland. I mean, I have to tell you, if I were part of that group of people at that time, I would have a really difficult time keeping my faith, maintaining hope. But this was God's direction to them. They were to live peacefully and contribute to the wellness of the region while remaining faithful to God. And they didn't know it at the time, but even after the exile in Babylon, again, history shows us, the Jewish people would forever be under the rule of an imperial outside force. So it was the Persians with Cyrus, then it was the Greeks, then it was the Romans. God's instruction to them was basically helping them to form new habits and setting new expectations for the rhythms of their lives. Daniel's stories were therefore instructive for the people of God on how to live faithfully under such circumstances. Everything was changing. So the first section of Daniel, as I said, provides our setting, and it also establishes who Daniel is and what his gifts are. God has given Daniel the ability to interpret dreams, among other gifts, and Babylon's king was very interested in the well-educated and gifted, the nobility and the elites, and he ordered that they all would be placed in his service immediately. So the text says it like this. Young men without physical defect and handsome, versed in every branch of wisdom, endowed with knowledge and insight, and competent to serve in the king's palace. They were to be taught the literature and language of the Chaldeans. And side note, the Chaldeans are mentioned a few times in Daniel. Some scholars believe that it was used at the time to refer to a specific social class of men, all men, who were highly educated and influential, known for their study of astrology and astronomy. So Chaldea, of course, was a region, but that's not what this is referring to here. So we're still in Babylon, but the Chaldeans were a distinct group of people who were highly regarded. All right, so the king assigned all of these ones, all the handsome ones that he brought over, the king assigned them a daily portion of the royal rations of food and wine. They were to be educated for 3 years so that at the end of that time, they could be stationed in the king's court. Daniel was one of those, and 3 others were with him as well that are named in the text. We have Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, though they are often referred to by their Babylonian names, which might sound familiar to you, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The name change, I have to tell you, for the Jewish exiles made me think of a modern parallel, which is when West Africans who were enslaved here and elsewhere were brought to their various countries. They all had names that their parents gave them, of course, but their names were typically changed to fit the culture they were sold into as a way to force assimilation and erase the individual's culture and history. So Daniel was also given a Babylonian name, Belteshazzar. You've never heard that though, right? So the text mainly refers to him as Daniel. I don't have an answer as to why he's Daniel, but the other 3 have their Babylonian names. So I just plan to use all their Hebrew names, so just so you know. So Daniel and his 3 friends are our characters then that we follow for these stories. Now there are 6 stories. I'm going to try to summarize each one pretty quickly for us. I'm going to split it into 2 halves. We'll do 3 at a time. And I'm breaking like all the sermon rules today with this because it's just like too much. But I think it's really important, so just try to hang with me. If you need to get more coffee, you can do it. So I just read to you that the king had assigned daily portions of royal food and wine for these guys. But Daniel knew that the foods he was going to be given would defile him according to God's law. So he instead asked for vegetables and water because there was no danger of violating God's law if there was not any meat or dairy, right? And God honored his faithfulness. Daniel and his friends were healthier than their counterparts who did eat the royal food, and after the 3 years of education, Daniel and his friends also grew to be the best among all of those who were in training. So vegetables make you more handsome, I think is the lesson. So the text says, no one was found to compare with Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Daniel was also given insight into all visions and dreams. Which leads us to the second story in chapter 2. Each chapter is a story. So the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, had a dream that none of his wise men could interpret. They all came before him and did the performative, "Oh, great king, live forever. Tell us your dream and we will reveal the interpretation." Nebuchadnezzar, though, was so troubled by his desire to understand this dream, and he wanted to be sure that they weren't just pulling one over on him. So he said that they had to tell him what the dream was and offer interpretation. And if they couldn't do it, then they would be, quote, torn limb from limb and their houses laid to ruins. And they were all like, what? Literally no one can do that. That's the Christie version of the, but so they said to him, no one except the gods could reveal this to you. And so he flew into a rage and demanded that they all be executed. It's crazy. The executioner then was getting ready to kill all of these men and searching for Daniel and his friends because they were part of this crew of wise men. And Daniel was like, whoa, hang on, why do you want to kill all, what's going on? Because he wasn't there, I guess. So the executioner explains, it's all explained to him what's going on, and he was able to convince the king to give him a little time so that he could provide what the king was demanding. So Daniel goes home, prays, tells his buddies to pray, and God gives the information to Daniel. So Daniel's able to return to the king, tell him in detail what he dreamed, and provide an interpretation. He saved the lives of all of his friends, as well as what sounds like just dozens of other Babylonians who were in service to the king. So Daniel gave God the credit, of course, and Nebuchadnezzar praised God as truly God of gods and Lord of kings. Daniel was promoted, and his 3 friends were also given expanded influence. So the third story then features Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, but recalling that their names are Babylonian in the text, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, this is one of the better known stories of the fiery furnace, so this might be how you kind of know their names. King Nebuchadnezzar had built a giant golden statue of himself. It was 90 feet tall. The scripture says 60 cubits, so I Googled it, 90 feet. And according to the website, Dimensions of Stuff, .com or something, it's a real website, guys. But 90 feet, because my husband always laughs at me, because I'm when we try to picture things, I'm you gotta draw a picture, or I don't know, build the thing so I can see it. I'm bad at this. So I had to, how big is 90 feet? I don't know, is this 90 feet? How many bananas? I didn't do that part. So anyway, 90 bananas? Maybe a banana's, I don't know. Okay, but 90 feet is twice the height of the letters of the Hollywood sign. Right? Thank you. I was like, whoa. Okay, 1/4 the size of a football field, twice the size of a brachiosaurus. So the one in your backyard, you're yeah, that's about right. We all have those. The exact width of the Golden Gate Bridge, 90 feet. So I don't know if any of that helps us, maybe. So roughly 7.5 stories is what we're talking about. So the point, of course, 90 feet is very, very tall. This was a massively huge statue. And King Nebuchadnezzar gathered all the leaders of the land, all of his governors, treasurers, the Chaldeans, the justices, the magistrates, everybody, for the dedication of this humongous golden statue. So when everyone was assembled, the herald announced that when the music kicked in, they were all supposed to bow down, fall down, and worship the statue. Right? They had a big band. Not a big band, not like Glenn Miller. They had a large collection of musicians. Okay, so when the music kicks in, it's all listed in the scripture. When the music kicks in and the entire crowd falls down in worship of this 7-story statue, everyone then, except Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And this really mattered because they had been appointed over the affairs of the entire province of Babylon. They were high-ranking leaders, and their refusal to bow down caused Nebuchadnezzar, say it with me, to fly into a murderous rage. So it's like that's like what he does. He's like, ew, I don't like you, execute. He gave them one more chance to bow down to his statue, but they refused. And so he ordered that they be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire, and it was heated to 7 times its customary temperature. I don't know what customary temperature is for a furnace, but I imagine like those kilns or like where they blow glass or something where it's like just really super hot. The men who had bound them and were responsible to throw them in, those men burned up. That's how hot it was, that they got close enough to toss them in and then like themselves were burned up. So even so, our 3 faithful servants of God, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, survived this like literally intense persecution, literal fiery persecution. The story goes on that Nebuchadnezzar was astonished to see 4 men then walking around in the furnace in the middle of the fire, unharmed, and the 4th man, the scripture says, had the appearance of a god. King Nebuchadnezzar called out to them to come out of the furnace, like he wasn't getting close, right? So he yelled at them. And so they did. They came out and they were perfectly fine. Not one hair was singed, nor were any threads of their clothing scorched. The king was so amazed that he offered public praise to God, that's a big deal, and promoted Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah yet again. All right, so 3 stories so far. We good? The first was Daniel and his friends remaining faithful to the law of God through what they ate. The second was the king's demand to be told what his dream was and its interpretation. And the third is the story of the statue and the literal fiery persecution. All right, the next 3, I'm gonna take a sip of water. All right, you're doing great, you know. So the 4th story begins with Nebuchadnezzar describing yet another dream. It's interesting because it's first person, the way it's recorded, so he's speaking of it. So he's describing it to Daniel this time, but then commanding Daniel to tell him what it means. And this one is fairly shocking, I think. So Nebuchadnezzar's dream is about a tree that gets chopped down, a very grand tree that gets chopped down. And Daniel, the text says, is severely distressed by his thoughts after he hears about the dream. And here's why. The interpretation of the dream requires Daniel to tell the king that the dream is of the future and what will happen to the king. And Daniel says, because you, O great king, have elevated yourself above God, you will become insane, driven away from human society, and you will live with the animals. This will continue until you have learned that the Most High God has sovereignty over all the earth. Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar, you are the great tree that will be chopped down. The dream also showed that Nebuchadnezzar would be restored to his place as king after learning that God is sovereign. And Daniel told him, you need to repent and seek righteousness and the mercy of the Lord. Said this to the king. But I guess the king did not do that because 1 year later, it all came to pass just as Daniel said. The text says that he was standing on a rooftop somewhere, like looking over his kingdom and like all puffed up. Look what I've built. And immediately went insane. So, yes, I encourage you to read it all for yourself. I really am glossing over a lot. There's a lot of detail about the tree and its beauty and all these things. And all of these are great things to read. But the crucial thing for us to understand here is what Daniel had to do. This was speaking truth to power in just about the most dangerous and difficult circumstance ever. Nebuchadnezzar, right, as I mentioned a moment ago, has already shown us he has no qualms executing people. So he very well could have responded to Daniel like, yep, that sounds like a terrible thing, and you're going to die now, you know? But anyway, so the 5th story in these chapters introduces a new king of Babylon. So at this point, Nebuchadnezzar had passed away, and his son Belshazzar has taken the throne. Well, Belshazzar, as sons of kings are wont to do, will throw a huge party. And he is using, though, the sacred vessels from the Temple of Jerusalem that the Babylonian armies had pillaged and destroyed, and they brought everything back with them. So he and everyone in his party are using these sacred vessels to drink wine from. They drank and drank and drank and praised the gods of gold and silver. Suddenly, the text says, the fingers of a human hand appeared and began writing on the plaster of the wall of the royal palace next to the lampstand. So everyone could see. I like that part that it was like next to the lampstand. Everybody got to see. And the king turned pale and was terrified. No one could read the writing or understand its meaning. None of his wise Chaldeans or the wise men, diviners, none of them. But Belshazzar's queen remembered Daniel and the ways that he had helped Nebuchadnezzar, so they called for Daniel. The king offered him riches, the rank of third in the kingdom if he could help, but boy, did Daniel let this guy have it. He said he wasn't interested in any gifts or rewards, and he called out every bit of bad behavior of Belshazzar. Got to read it for yourself. Chastised him for not learning from what Nebuchadnezzar had endured. You know, he was like, you watched your dad endure all this stuff, and here you are. Very bad. Again, we see Daniel speaking truth to power and telling this king that the writing on the wall means he will lose his entire kingdom to neighboring powers. God has numbered your days. You have been weighed and measured and found wanting, and you are going to lose your kingdom. Imagine the courage it took to say all of this to the king in front of his party, in front of his lackeys and toadies and all these people who relied on him for their position and their power. And as always, Daniel was right. That very night, Belshazzar was killed, and Darius the Persian took over. So the final story happens under King Darius while Daniel is still in service, right? He lived his whole life in service to the throne. And it is likely the most famous story. So it begins with King Darius determining that he would have all of the regional governors report to just 3 administrators who then reported to himself. It's a very good delegation, I think. So Daniel was one of these 3 administrators, very quickly, as he always did, proved to be the most excellent and the most trustworthy. So Darius was planning to place Daniel in charge of the whole kingdom. The other administrators, of course, and governors, all of them were all jealous. They began plotting against Daniel because he was such an upright person, right? He's praying 3 times a day to the Lord. He's following God's law. They're plotting against him, but they can't find any flaw in Daniel. So they convinced the king to pass a law stating that for 30 days, no one was permitted to pray to any god or any human other than to the king. If anyone was found to do so, they would be thrown into the lion's den. And Darius agreed. What the ego this guy has, right? That sounds good. Pray to me. I like that. You know, and Darius agreed and signed the document, not knowing, of course, that he was sealing Daniel's fate. Well, Daniel continues to pray to God and lives his faithful life, but those who were plotting, right, they were watching and they were ready. They told the king that Daniel was being willfully disobedient, continuing to pray 3 times a day, even though the king had passed this law. The king, of course, was greatly distressed because he loved Daniel, right? He was going to make him over the whole kingdom. And so he was like, oh, I didn't see this coming. I don't know how, but anyway, if you know this guy so well. But anyway, so he was so distressed and he tried everything he could do to rescue Daniel. So I think that shows to his character. Really seemed to love Daniel, but the kind of law that it was, the kind of decree that those plotting against Daniel had written was an unbreakable law. So even the king had no way to undo this thing that he had done. He had no choice but to throw Daniel to the lions. As they were sealing up the lion's den, Darius said, "May your God, whom you faithfully serve, rescue you." And the king did not sleep all night long, and at daybreak he rushed to the lion's den, calling out to Daniel, and he discovered, if you've heard the story before, you know that Daniel was alive. God had shut the mouths of the lions, and Daniel was not harmed. In response to this event, Darius had those, this is kind of gross, but Darius had those who were plotting against Daniel thrown into the lion's den, along with their entire families. I read that, I was like, oh, anyway. But the text says that he then, the lions ate them up really fast too. So it's not that the lions weren't hungry. Anyway, God worked a miracle, and then other people got eaten. But the text says that Darius then wrote to all peoples of all nations all over the world, declaring the sovereignty and goodness of God, who is to be feared and revered. So that was the second half. You're doing great. I see some people kind of, it's all right, it's a lot. But so we had our second half. Nebuchadnezzar had that dream, right? That Daniel was speaking truth to power with a serious warning about the king's attitude. Then we had the writing on the wall with that other king, Belshazzar, and another truth to power moment when Daniel had to tell the king his bad behavior was going to lead to his destruction. And finally, we have the story of Daniel being persecuted, again, despite living a blameless life and serving God faithfully. So now hopefully you've kept track of some of the threads through all of this, right? Daniel's stories serve the purpose of giving the people of God explicit examples of how one might live with integrity while not losing their place of influence. When they were living under empire, being pushed to abandon their culture, abandon the law of God, and assimilate, these stories of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah all serve to tell those who were suffering under oppressive forces that they would survive. Have hope, these stories say, for there is a God in heaven who is on the side of the marginalized, the harassed, the meek, and the unjustly persecuted. But these stories also warn that following God's law, standing up for what is right, may also put us in harm's way. There is often risk associated with speaking out for justice. Other lessons we can pull from these stories are that Daniel never wielded his religion as a weapon. He quietly kept on, maintaining his faith, living his life, and giving God the credit when miracles happened. Importantly, none of these men ever played the victim card either, right? Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah had no idea that they would be preserved from the fiery furnace when they chose to literally stand up to the most powerful man alive. Babylon at that time was like the largest city in the world. So just, if we can try to imagine the scope of that power, imagine the sea of people that they were standing up amidst. Everyone was bowing down, the pressure to just comply upon threat of certain death. They did not know what the future held and that they were going to experience a miracle. But just as the Jewish people had no idea that their exile in Babylon would ever end, and yet they continued on, cultivating gardens, praying for peace and prosperity as God had instructed them to, and making the best of their very awful circumstances. So we cannot know what the future holds. One lesson here for us is that every small act of hope is also an act of resistance against oppressive forces, I think. So I was drinking a glass of water the other day, and it kind of occurred to me that even something small like that is like my own little personal act of hope, drinking water. So in the winter, my skin gets super dry, and so I try to drink a lot more water in the winter, but in those moments, it's not gonna fix it right away. Do you know what I mean? I'm like trusting the process. Oh, trusting the process. But I'm trusting the process and having hope, and it really is an act of hope for tomorrow that I will be able to persist because today I drank enough water and I did that small thing that is a hopeful act of resistance. Every small act of hope, act of resistance against oppressive forces. So Daniel's actions were also community-minded, right? Think of the story of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, where he was threatening to execute all of the wise men in service to him. Daniel was not working for only his own benefit, but for the benefit of others as well, right? He was saving the lives of everybody in service, and indeed, he was impacting the entire exiled community by making the captives from Judah look good, He was community-minded in his faithfulness. So I wanted to close today by sharing just a 2.5-minute video of something else that happened earlier in the week. Now, when I first encountered this event this week on Tuesday, I was like, oh, that really fits in beautifully and is like a lovely modern example of some of the things I'm talking about. And then it went totally bonkers viral. So you have very probably already seen this, maybe multiple times, but I still wanted to share this because the moment that I heard what this person had to say, I instantly thought of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah living in exile under oppression and bravely standing up and speaking truth to the most powerful men on earth. So the video is Episcopalian Bishop Mary Ann Buddy, who delivered the homily at the National Prayer Service this last week. And maybe you missed it, and that's okay too, so now you'll see it. But the entire homily, I encourage you to just listen to the whole thing. It's 14 minutes, I think. We're just gonna see the end. The whole homily was about unity and the humility that is required for us to live in Christ-like unity. The bishop wrapped her homily, though, with a plea directed at the newly inaugurated president, and I'll let you watch her words.
Let me make one final plea, Mr. President. Millions have put their trust in you. And as you told the nation yesterday, you have felt the providential hand of a loving God. In the name of our God, I ask you to have mercy upon the people in our country who are scared now. There are gay, lesbian, and transgender children in Democratic, Republican, and independent families, some who fear for their lives. And the people who pick our crops and clean our office buildings, who labor in poultry farms and meat packing plants, who wash the dishes after we eat in restaurants and work the night shifts in hospitals. They may not be citizens or have the proper documentation, but the vast majority of immigrants are not criminals. They pay taxes and are good neighbors. They are faithful members of our churches and mosques, synagogues, wadara, and temples. I ask you to have mercy, Mr. President, on those in our communities whose children fear that their parents will be taken away, and that you help those who are fleeing war zones and persecution in their own lands to find compassion and welcome here. Our God teaches us that we are to be merciful to the stranger, for we were all once strangers in this land. May God grant us the strength and courage to honor the dignity of every human being, to speak the truth to one another in love, and walk humbly with each other and our God for the good of all people in this nation and the world. Amen.
Yeah. Yes, she's amazing. On Tuesday, I shared it on social media and was like, this amazing bishop. She's amazing, Episcopalian bishop. She's just amazing. So yes, band, you can come on up. I have just like a couple more things to say. So this series is called Leadership in Exile, and we are seeking to learn from the stories we have in our scriptures that reveal to us how people of faith behaved during times of great oppression and fear. To my mind, Bishop Buddy chose to behave as Daniel or Daniel's three friends did, adhering to their understanding of what is right and true, and bravely speaking the truth. And if you've been following the news this week, you'll know that she is being persecuted for speaking out for justice, just outright attacked. Congressional Representative Mike Collins from Georgia posted on social media that, quote, the person giving this sermon should be added to the deportation list. Bishop Buddy was born and raised in this country and, of course, cannot be deported. Like, it's just, I know, right? What? But, of course, when I saw that, I was reminded then of this text. Again, like, I wonder how many of the people around King Belshazzar, right, in his grand feast, started slandering Daniel when they heard his interpretation of the writing on the wall. So listen, my friends, we are in a serious time. This bishop was gently asking the leader of our land to show mercy to the most vulnerable in the name of the God that he claims to follow. And I'm not here to talk politics or like give an opinion on that man. That's not my role. My role here is to love you and to encourage you. And I want to leave you then with a kind of tender warning that you, choosing to follow Jesus, you may be called to be that unlikely person who will stand up for justice. You may be called to use your influence to protect others or speak truth to power. And you may find yourself standing alone for the way of Jesus, this way of nonviolence, inclusive community, and redemptive love. This is not the way of the powerful. It is my earnest prayer for us that we will continue to choose the way of Jesus, as we have been, as we were singing about this morning, choosing mercy and peace, choosing grace and love, and always widening who is included in this blessed community. So I invite you to stand and sing together.